So you already know everything about me there is to know that I came from the University of Kansas. I'm a child psychologist by training and a special educator by avocation. I never meant to be in a special ed department. But a couple of interesting things happened to me. One of them was that Vanderbilt was recruiting, and I was married at the time, and they had 2 faculty jobs, and that's how a lot of people end up somewhere, because there are 2 good jobs. But when I was a postdoc, I was doing this kind of interesting thing, that I was a postdoc in linguistics and human development. So I was taking courses in child language, and I had agreed to do this study that involved going to a residential treatment center for children with significant disabilities. Now, I'd grown up with a brother with autism, and I'd been around people with disabilities my entire life, but I'd never been to an institution before. And this was a life-changing 2 years, because every work day, every school day, I went out there and I watched children not talking. And I watched staff interacting with kids in ways that were not, not abusive or painful in that sort of way, but painful in that they didn't talk to kids. And although they took good care of kids, they didn't have the kinds of relationships that would foster learning to talk. And in those 2 years, I went from swearing I would never be a teacher and I would never work with children to absolutely passionate about early intervention, because I was convinced that a lot of those children didn't need to be living in a residential treatment center, and that we could learn things about how to intervene early and well so that they could have different outcomes. And pretty much that's what my life has been about ever since then. My teaching is very much shaped by my research, and my research is about how kids learn language, and especially what we can do when kids aren't learning language. I've been really lucky to have a lot of good grant support and a lot of opportunities to study children from a lot of different backgrounds. And I am endlessly enthusiastic and appreciative of the context that Vanderbilt provides for me, where I can be a researcher and a teacher, and those 2 things fit together really well. My research is what my lab jokingly calls blue-collar research. It's about the Toys R Us approach, and it's about being with little kids, going to families' homes, working in Head Start, working in preschools like the Susan Gray School and High Hopes out in Brentwood, and really trying to figure out what we can do to help caregivers support kids' language development and how we can have better outcomes for kids. This is my friend Poppy. She's one of the kids that I actually get to work with. And this week was a really big week for Poppy because she walked by herself for the first time. She just turned 2. And she's beginning to spontaneously imitate words when other people say them. And that's such a breakthrough for little kids. And also she fed herself dinner by herself, and her mom emailed me at 11:30 last night that it was the first time in 2 years she hadn't fed her kid, and she was really excited. And that's what I mean by blue-collar research, but good stuff. Those of you who know Peabody probably know something about Susan Gray, for whom my endowed chair is named. Susan Gray was one of the most remarkable people ever, arguably the mother of Head Start, and a brilliant woman who was president of American Psychological Association and did one of the first big randomized clinical studies of early intervention out in Murfreesboro. She was also an amazingly gifted teacher of young children, and I am endlessly grateful to her and honored to have a chair that's in her name. So today what I want to talk about, and then I want you to talk about with me, are some things about language and how it's learned. Oh good, we have a language learner. Perfect. Hi there. What parents contribute to that, and parents defined broadly to include caregivers and grandparents and aunts and people who spend time with kids. And then a little bit about what our intervention does to enhance what parents do for their children's language learning. This will be way more fun if I'm not the only person talking, so ask me questions as we go. Jump in, make comments, tell me what you don't understand, ask for help or clarification, and we'll chat as we go. I don't care if I don't get to the end of my slides, and I know that you won't care, so let's talk together. It'll be a lot more fun. So this is my very biased view of the world, that language is about the most interesting, complex, delicious thing that you could possibly study anywhere. Not everybody agrees with that, and usually the first time I say that in my class, people groan kind of loudly. But it's so wonderful because there are so many moving parts. And although we think about language as having vocabulary or meaning, syntax or sentences, phonology or a sound system, and pragmatics, which is the social way that we're all talking and being together here, there's a lot more to it than that. And each of those pieces is a puzzle within a puzzle. One of the big parts of language is this translation from what we know to what we say, from what we understand to what we can produce. And those two systems, although they're really closely related, are often independent in children. A young child understands way more than he produces, as does a husband, I think, but maybe not so much. Women, on the other hand, might say things that they don't understand. We're never clear about that, but we talk a lot, and that's probably a gender difference that has some biological roots to it. We know that cognition is a driving force in language development, but we also know it's not the only force, and we know that you can be brilliant and not be a speaker, and you can be not so brilliant and still be able to communicate really effectively. So when kids start to talk, they have to manage at least three big things. They have to manage the speech production system, which is all about sounds and how that's produced, and the mechanism for that is enormously complex and wonderful and amazing, and the fact that we speak with such automaticity without thinking about whether we're also breathing or moving, and how we synchronize all of those literally thousands of muscles that have to be coordinated by the brain in order to modulate sounds. These little kids that we have that are in this project that have cleft palates, for example, are so smart that they learn to make sounds before their palate is repaired using a different part of the vocal mechanism. So a lot of what we're doing with them is trying to compensate for those errors and teach them other ways to produce sounds that will ultimately make them more intelligible. But these are kids that by the time they're about 15 or 16 months have developed pretty good compensatory strategies for communication when there's a barrier there that's a physical barrier. So speech can be a big deal. You can communicate and you can have language without speech, and many people do. Signing is a perfectly wonderful way to communicate and to use language that doesn't involve speech. Language is words and sentences, loosely, but there's a lot of parts to language, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And communication, which is kind of the base of all this, is how do we use language? And how do we communicate with each other in ways that are verbal and nonverbal, and that link together these components of the language system. Language really is a set of systems, and what's interesting is that each of them is rule-governed, predictable, learnable, difficult, and each of them is generative. And by generative, I mean that each system can, from a set of rules, produce an utterance that's appropriate to any occasion. And how that generativity part works, how we can generate an endless number of different sentences that have different syntax structure, but have the meaning that's just right for the occasion. The level of precision and complexity of that rule learning is obviously a cognitive task, but also a language-specific task. And language is also a social system, and we know that culture, for example, influences a lot of differences in communication, and that somehow kids read one culture versus another. We were talking about Head Start kids, and that's a really good example of kids that are often bicultural in that they have one set of language and social behavior for the classroom and another set for home and neighborhood. And in this country, a lot of kids make those transitions. So the systems are about phonology or sounds, about meaning, about how words are formed, plurals and past tense and all those things that we add to it, about how sentences are organized, and how we use language in context.
If you're reading quietly, right, I'm just reading a book, do our vocal cords move?
Not usually. Are you whispering in the dark?
No, I back when I was a psychologist.
We thought that it was covert that one of the ways that we did language was that we just were covert in those movements. Probably not because it's not efficient, because you're probably a really skilled reader. And when we read, we go much faster than you would typically produce language. And you also don't usually read word by word, but you read in a kind of more global way. But reading is one of the things I'm not talking about today, but this is all the foundation for reading. Every one of these systems turns out to be important when you move to print. Even phonology, which we hadn't really thought about the sound system. Turns out a lot of my baby clef kids are not good readers when they get to first grade because they had difficulty with sound discrimination early on, and that kind of phonological awareness that allows us to segment words and to do things like say cow without the "k" is hard for these kids because the production of sound was difficult and they may have learned those patterns differently early on. Not big. It's not that they can't read. It's that it slows them down in reading. Good question, and good for you for asking. So this is a more complicated slide. I just want to say this one time and then I won't say it again. Language is really complicated. It's deliciously complicated or frustratingly complicated, depending on your point of view. It's dynamic and it's changing. Did you ever used to read William Safire in the New York Times Magazine, constantly complaining about how language is changing? But that's the nature of language. It's socially, contextually sensitive, and the meanings of words change, our style of talking changes. I used to have my nephews, I'd pick them up at KCI and drive out to my sister's, and I would try and have them give me all the cool words. You know, this is right after my nephew said, "Oh, Auntie Ann, you have the best vintage collection of music." And I'm like, vintage? This is my music. But even when they told me the cool things to say, when they came out of my mouth, they didn't sound the same because I didn't have the prosody right, and I didn't really discriminate the social occasion in which you were supposed to say them. So I just ended up sounding like their old Aunt Ann who shouldn't be trying to use those words. But that's the nature of language. And right now, lots of people are worried about what's happening to language because we become texters, and we don't use language in that way. We're a multimedia culture, and really it's only the last 2 generations, I think, that this has really been true for, and we don't know yet what that's going to mean for spoken language. I don't notice that people are talking less. The things I do notice is people are talking on their cell phones, probably more if we looked at rate per minute, and also we tell everyone we love them now. When did this happen? You know? That's a really good example of something that did not used to be culturally appropriate. And when you did say I love you, you were kind of like nervous about it because, oh my God, what if he doesn't love me back? And now we just tell, we tell everyone we love them. Well, that's probably because the meaning of that and the social interaction around that has come to be something different. And I suspect there are other ways that we tell the person that we love them that doesn't overlap, but the language changes and moves. Texting is interesting because it's like the demise of grammar. William Safire was right, we've gone to hell in a handbasket. But it's what happens. Language is alive, and I'm sure we'll weather this as we've weathered other things. But that's part of not somebody was saying earlier, when do you get to talk to your kids again? Part of it is really that kids speak a different language than we do. And that's always going to be true. Every generation creates itself and creates its language, and the differences are subtle, but at some developmental periods, painfully noticeable for everybody. And isn't that cool? I really like that. Turns out language is a very vulnerable system, that all this complexity and sensitivity to social change also means a lot of things can go wrong, and even when little bitty things go wrong, it's very hard to get language right. So a really good example of that is being sleep deprived when you should not drive and you should probably not talk. And what I learned recently is if you have bad jet lag, don't send emails because you're not really monitoring what you're saying in that normative way. So something as small as sleep deprivation can make it hard to be articulate, hard to remember the words we're looking for. But we don't usually make great big grammatical errors, which is interesting because that system is so practiced and so well developed that along the fringes we lose our language, but we don't lose our ability to talk. Question?
I want to talk more about emails when you say language is vulnerable. Workplace now hides behind emails. Where 2 generations ago, you would have more face-to-face discussions and more emphasis on the meaning verbally. And now we're hiding behind emails. And I'm just wondering if that's vulnerability of the spoken word.
Possibly. I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
Well, I think that a lot of communication is done without words. So, if someone
Good point.
you can look at somebody while they're speaking. I agree with you. It's very impersonal to me, an email. So.
And even though it's written a certain way, it can be taken 2 ways, depending
Yes.
on how, like your inflection, which they don't hear if they're only reading it.
It's never clear to me if I'm hiding or disclosing more than I intended to in my emails. Anybody else have thoughts about that?
On that point, just see how complex that gets when you CC between other people.
Yes. Yes. Emails to me are sometimes scary because when things come out of my mouth, I'm safe. You all won't remember anything. As soon as you walk out the door, we're good. But if I send you an email, then you can go back and look at it again, and maybe I really was jet lagged and should have stepped away from the computer. But you have the written proof of it, and you can print off copies or send to 10 people, and that's difficult. And so it's one of the things that's hard about language learning is it's impermanent. It's transitory. The auditory signal comes and goes. And so obviously hearing, auditory perception, decoding, learning how to segment language in the pieces as they go by is hugely important skill. Reading is both easier and harder. The good part about text is you can see it. We put spaces between the words. But if you don't already have the language base, figuring that out about text is really hard. So interesting relationships. I don't know. What do you guys who are under the age of, say, 25 think about this texting thing? Better or worse?
I think that it's kind of taken away from a lot of personal communication. A lot of people are more comfortable with texting than they are talking face-to-face. So now, if I call my friends, they don't want to be called, they'd rather be texted. So I think it's really cut down phone calls.
Yeah.
More personable, and you hear like voice inflections, which I think are very important for determining how someone feels.
So even the phone is more personal than a text. Yeah. It used to be I would come back from a meeting and there would be like 15 of those pink slips like on my bulletin board. None. But my email was deadly. Yes?
I was going to say with the phone, you can at least hear the person's tone of voice as opposed to when you meet a person, you see their body gestures. When you text someone, you see the text that they write. So you can't tell more than that.
Also, think about this. Think about the difference of when you call someone and you're by yourself in your car talking to somebody and when you're standing in line at Starbucks. And if the person who's on the other end doesn't know you're at Starbucks and kind of being guarded because you're like right next to this person who's glaring at you for talking on your phone, the prosody and the voice tone and all of that can be very confusing to the person who's the listener because they don't have the visual context to know, oh, he's standing there in the middle of this place and he can't be more straightforward than this. He can't be warm and affectionate and bubbly because the lady next to him is going to punch him out if he talks loud. And that's one of the things about phone, not quite as bad as email, but language is so contextualized. And someone said there's more to language, more to communication than just the language part. That's so right, that we read, I always teach from 4 to 7, which is a deadly time to teach. And I know the glaze that goes over the room at 6 o'clock, and that Either we need to take a break and caffeinate, or I better have something really entertaining. But nobody's saying, excuse me, I am bored to death and falling asleep, but I know the glaze. And we read cues like that all the time. That's part of the communication package. Children with autism, for example, are really good at the literal content of language because they're pretty good decoders, but they're not good at reading the package that surrounds it. So they don't get humor sometimes, and they don't get sarcasm, but they also don't take into account more holistically the social context. And so it makes them very odd little people to interact with because they're like looking at you and at language through a little window when the rest of us are looking at it in a much broader basis. So that's actually a good example of being language competent but not very good at performance and communication. So your performance, this is what every undergraduate tells me all the time. This is not a good sample of my performance. Because I had 3 tests this week and I haven't slept in days and my parents are here visiting. And that's probably right. Performance and competence aren't always the same thing, and that's true in language as well. And we can be competent in one part of language but not in another. So I can read French pretty well, but I can't speak it. My only really bad grade as an undergraduate was in French 3, a D, because I had a native French speaker who wanted to give dictées all the time, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. That sort of difference between understanding and reading or understanding and speaking is not uncommon, and all of us have different degrees of skill in those different systems, and only once in a while do we run into them and find out about them. So when kids are developing language, it's generally pretty predictable, but kids are very individual, just as everyone in this room is. Kids meet developmental milestones at about the same time if they have the same opportunity. So the example of kids in Head Start, why are there more language delayed kids? Different opportunity, and different culture in terms of valuing language often. Kids go through phases where they're working on pieces and parts of language. They usually go through that phase and then kind of move on to a new phase. My little friend Poppy that you saw at the beginning is in the 2-year-old no phase. Yesterday in 30 minutes she said no 83 times because I was counting. It wasn't our best day together ever. One of the most important things is that most of language is for having fun. Life is about having a good time, and language makes that even better. And kids are so good at reminding us that words and sounds and just the stuff that you can do with language is enormously fun. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about early development because I think this is so interesting. You know, one of the things that we all celebrate is when our kids get their first word. It's like a really big deal. Well, there's a few things. One is that a lot of stuff happened before we got there. And the other is that first words are probably in the ear of the beholder as much as they are in the mouth of the child that's doing them. We actually know a lot about development in the first year of life that lays the foundation for that first word. And it turns out it's enormously important, but 2 things that are really important. One is learning to coordinate your attention with another person to talk about a thing. I didn't see this one. And that's part of the synchrony that lays the foundation for social communication. That I can do you and me and that, and refer you to that, and follow your reference to that bag is really critical. And it's something that kids learn between about 9 and 12 months. And the foundations of it emerge then, and probably by about 18 months it's pretty well established. And it's one of the first indicators when kids have autism that they don't acquire that coordination of you and me and that sharing of affect and interest and commenting. Oh, nice bag. That they do request, I want that water, but they don't share information. And that sharing, you and me talking about something that interests us both, or me showing or giving you something, is a really important foundation to language learning. The other thing that turns out to be important is a gesture. that this pointing of things away is kind of the physical, visual reference way of pointing out the naming of things. I see you. I see you. And we do that all the time. And kids do that before they have a word for it, but they're literally saying, oh, there it is, there it is. And it probably has something to do with beginning to segment the world, unitizing, as it's called, into knowable pieces and parts. And sometimes it's like asking, what else? Or what about that? And that little girl in the middle is such a great example of that kind of pointing. So words are like magic, because I think of them as being the first time you actually know what that little munchkin is thinking about, kind of, except that if you're a mom or a dad, you probably already know. The words that kids use are pretty predictable because those systems of phonology and meaning come together. And so the first things that kids say are the things that your mouth can make. So words like mama, daddy, papa, bottle, all of those are early, easy to produce sounds. And mom, dad, bottle, papa, mom, those kind of things also refer to things in the environment that are very salient. So the child discriminates the object or the person, has the sounds to put them together. It's an important event that the child understands. It's cognitively simpler than some things kids are going to understand later on. And so makes sense that those words emerge. It also helps that we're all there going, Mama, Daddy, say daddy, say daddy. She said daddy. I heard her say daddy long before kids say it. But that's part of how language, that's a general principle in language development, that caregivers and people who interact with kids scaffold their understanding of meaning and their production of words and their understanding of the social system, and that it really is like a dance. So kids make these sounds, they name salient objects, and they also start out with a lot of multi-purpose words. And you probably remember this from your kids, that a lot of kids have words. First, they have words that we don't have, like butta. What does butta mean? Butta can mean anything. Kids make up a little word, and they know that there are sounds that go with it, and that's the multi-purpose butta, butta, butta. And then they have a few words that work for them really well, like more. Every kid in America can now sign more because of baby signs. And they use that for everything. And only when those words kind of don't work well enough, I mean more cookies, not more milk or cereal, more cookies, that they begin to refine what they're able to say. Kids have different styles, and some of those styles persist over a lifetime, and one of them is kids that are referential versus expressive language users. There are some kids that don't have very big vocabularies, even though they're really smart kids, or at least they don't use them productively, because they're all about the social. And actually, my little friend Poppy is like this. She's like, hey, to everybody. She knows everybody in the Susan Gray School. She's all about affect. Her favorite word is next to listen. And she uses those words for everything. Hooks you right in. Very social kid. But then there are kids that are learning language in that really, I'm going to know 400 words really soon. And some of those are boys and some of those are girls. I have a little friend, Matthew, who, really knows all kinds of things that I'm surprised that 2-year-olds know. And another friend, Aurora, whose first word was panda, but went on to know brown bear, panda, and other animals before she said mom and dad. That's a kid who's a referential, I want to know the name of that particular thing. And those are two styles that kids often have early on. There's a whole lot of things that have to come together. Kids, especially attention, perception, understanding of phonology, memory, that are all primarily cognitively based, but have differentiated systems for all of those parts. Motor ability matters if you're going to be a speaker, but not if you're going to be a language user. Stephen Hawkins is an extremely brilliant man who is an amazing language user who has almost no intelligible speech. And so speech, language, not the same thing, although usually together. And things that, if you have a kid with a speech impairment, a stutter, or whatever, might be the most brilliant child alive, because that speech production part isn't about cognition. It's about motor ability. Yes?
I was wondering if you've studied infants who were preemies in your lab, and did that changes any of this time frame of development?
Well, gestational age matters. If you were born earlier, then your whole development's going to be a little bit later. You know, it depends. It depends on how premature and why, and it depends on who your mama is. If you have a middle-class educated mom being a preemie who's not exceptionally small and hasn't had birth insults, meaning a stroke or some kind of bleed of some sort as a baby or other major health problems, you're probably going to be fine. Although the smaller the baby and the more complex the health situation, the more likely that there will be language delays. But lots of preemies turn out to be just fine. Yeah. Yeah.
I raised 2 girls, but now I'm watching my niece's 18-month-old, and he's a boy. That's my first boy. And he was all about motor. You know, had to learn to sit and crawl and walk and stand and all of that before he was really interested at all in language. And I found we were using science with him, but I found that almost was an impediment because
He wanted to move and not...
but he knew he could get what he wanted by doing this and not having to talk. So I found myself saying, no, you tell me with your words, you know, and he started to understand that he needed to do that. But I mean, I'm wondering how much of a disservice is it for them?
None. There's the data on kids that sign before they speak doesn't inhibit learning to talk. For some kids, like kids with Down syndrome, it actually makes learning to talk easier. But that doesn't mean that any given kid won't do what he can get by with. And boys generally talk later than girls and initially have smaller vocabularies than girls. They have better motor development. They have busier lives. They're doing other stuff. It's not an IQ difference, and it goes away by age 4 for the most part.
Stuttering is environmental effect or?
Not usually. Stuttering is usually linked to anxiety, and it can be a motor disruption. It can have different sources. Exacerbated by social performance and being nervous, just, you know, like everything else, but can be linked to motor development. Not necessarily a big psychological problem, although if you're a stutterer, you often end up feeling pretty anxious about it, and you can kind of bootstrap on that.
Wasn't there just a study out, though, that there's a genetic link to stuttering?
There's a genetic link for almost every language-related thing. That's because there's a big genetic component to language, yeah. And that's true for the best predictor of whether your child will have a language problem is, did someone in your family, probably a male relative, and that's the strongest link in stuttering as well, have a language problem. So before you marry anyone, find out when they started talking and was their mother worried they had autism. If the answers to those things are late, and she was, that doesn't mean you shouldn't marry them, but you should kind of know what you're getting into. I come from a family of engineers where none of the men talk, but I don't think it's a bad thing. I'm just saying it's a gender difference. But they do math really well. Environment makes a difference in a lot of things. And I think this question around stuttering is a good one. How much difference does it make? I don't think that environment causes stuttering, but environment can affect performance a lot. And kids that are safe and secure work through stuttering differently. Kids that get intervention work through stuttering differently than kids who have other things going on in their lives. Environment makes a huge difference in language learning, mostly because parents make a huge difference and input makes a huge difference, and I'll talk about that in a second. What's modeled, what's valued, style. If you come from a family of talkers, my husband, so I come from this big German family where all the women are large and talk a lot, And the first time that Bill went home with me, and my nephews, even though one of them grew up to be an engineer, were much in this mode. And so the first night at dinner, here's one of my nephews with his economics project, and he's presenting it to the rest of the family and arguing that we old people are ruining the economy because we're going to get all the Social Security money. And this huge argument ensues, and yada, yada, you get the picture. Well, I thought Bill was going to go under the table because in his family, no one talks during dinner, and afterwards, his mom cleans up, and then everyone goes in the living room and watches golf or something. And those, both of us come from perfectly wonderful families, but really different styles about talking. And his brother is actually an engineer, a brilliant one who doesn't talk. But so it's not even about that particular style. It is about what your family culture is like. And it's not even about ethnicity as much as it is how does your family operate. So kids become talkers or not talkers, fluent, loud, all sorts of things based on how their family interacts and whether they like that or they're trying not to grow up to be like that.
Okay, I heard that bilingual kids, like one mom's speaking one language, the dad's speaking another, they start speaking later on in development. Like, is that true?
Sometimes. It's, because they're trying to sort it out, but there's no disadvantage to being bilingual, and ultimately there's probably an advantage to it. And kids are hilarious. We have a little boy who has Down syndrome right now whose mother is Dutch. And so he only knows about 10 words, and half of them are Dutch and half of them are English. And it doesn't really matter because he's at that single word stage, and he'll sort it out. And everybody knows the 5 words that he knows now, so it turns out to be fine. I think it's much harder for kids who are English language learners and are coming to school, and there's one language being spoken at home and another at school, and they're having a hard time making the transition into academic learning. But most of those kids ultimately do pretty well if we can keep them in school and give them appropriate supports for becoming fluent English language users.
Is it more difficult for them if they're more than 2 languages? Because I know a little boy who has an Arabic dad, a Latino mom, living in Montreal, going to a French daycare, and then going to go to an English school later.
Once he gets started, he'll be really good. As Middle Americans, we're like the only people in the world that only speak one language. And so we think, oh my gosh, that must be hard. But most of the children in the world actually are exposed to more than one language. There's not a lot of data on kids that are really multilingual in that way, but a lot on bilingual kids, especially French and English-speaking kids, more on Hispanic children who speak English and Spanish. Parenting style makes a difference, and you have 2 parents, so it isn't like one of you has control over how your child turns out. You probably already know that, right? But the style and the way that you interact with one another and the way you respond to your child makes a huge difference. I just wanted to show you a little bit of data because data are fun. So these are 4 kids who are all typical kids, and along the bottom, you see starting at 14 months and going at about 2.5-week intervals over time, when kids started to talk and how quickly they got to a marker that's kind of important, which is 100 words. And the message here is that we have kids that start early and hop right up there like the first kid. We have kids that develop slowly over time. We have kids that hang out for very long times and then talk all at once. And we also have kids that hang out for really long times and acquire slowly. So your nephew is probably like that spurt at 22 months kind of kid. And there's no qualitative difference in those kids' language. It's just about time for onset. And these are all typical kids. One of the interesting things is that kids have really well-developed strategies for how to learn language. And there's a lot of research about this. They know that there's some things they can dependably count on. People use words to mark things that are new in the environment. You can fast map. You can figure out if this is a computer and this is a bottle and she's talking about the clicker. I know what the computer is. I know what the bottle is. This must be the remote control or the clicker. And kids really quickly use rules like exclusion, similarity, grouping things together in semantic categories. They learn from contrast and they learn from convention. They learn from reading books. If you're going to do my 2 things, if you're going to help your kid learn language, respond to what they say and read to them, because those are terribly important. Kids know how words work before they know words, so if you don't know the word, make up a word, and people will help you. They'll give you information to make that work. One of the interesting things that's happening in the brain in all of this is that there are a couple of times when there's a brain-wide reorganization that seems to happen to accommodate kids' rapid learning of language. One is pretty early on, around 18 months or so, about the time you're seeing that word spurt. And another is around 4 years old, and another is around 7 years old, because those are kind of marker times when the complexity of language and how we use it changes exponentially. So at 18 months, usually kids are beginning to have about 100 words, and they're getting ready to combine words. And that's a really big deal, but now you have to know those rules for combining words and how to say things in combination of words. And you need to store and retrieve words differently and have rules for how to do that. Kids understand that before they do it. They've got to have enough of those individual words before they can pull it off. But there's a pretty predictable outcome or order in which they do that. Although this is a place where being a second language learner gets you in trouble. So languages all have a structure. There are families of languages that have similar structures. English is an inordinately difficult language to learn because it's got more exceptions than it has rules, and we do a lot of goofy stuff in English. Everything else is much more orderly. But some things are easier to say in English because they are unmarked than they are in Spanish or Italian, where you have to mark the gender, and you have to, when you mark the verb, you mark the tense and the gender and the number, and you have to know all those things to add to it, where in English you can just say walk. But other things, it works in the other direction. There are things that are irregular verbs, like swim, swam, swum. Kids don't get that perfect past tense of swimming for a long time because it's hard to mark in English, but in other languages they get it really early. So even though beginning words are pretty similar, the first 50 words are pretty similar in concept across kids, as language gets more complex, you learn the things that are easier first. You always learn what's going to be useful, but you also learn things that are easier. And that's what gets complicated. And sometimes when kids are dual language learners, they'll use the word in the language that it's the easiest to say swimming in Italian than it is to say is swimming in English, and they'll use the word for it in Italian, which I think, kids are really smart. And this whole language learning thing lets us know, and we were all kids once, so guess what? That means we were really smart too, that they let us know all the time how amazingly smart they are. There are two big measures of language development: how big your vocabulary is. You probably all know this from taking any, the GRE or anything. It's all about those kind of words. A little bit of knowledge, but a lot about what words you know. And for little kids, how long the utterance is. Now, for adults, this is meaningless. We can speak in endlessly long sentences. But for little kids beginning to talk, these incremental growth from 1 word to 2 word to 3 word turns out to be really important. And not surprisingly, here are 3 very typical kids growing from using about 1.5 words per sentence to using about 4.5 words per sentence. And you see Miss Eve made that leap between 18 and 22 months. She went from being basically a 1-word user to being a 4-word sentence user. Whereas Adam and Sarah started later on combining words around 26 months, and Sarah was almost 3 before she was using 4 words together. Those kind of individual differences among kids who are smart and have no other particular developmental differences are pretty common. And that's part of what makes early language delays hard to diagnose, because there can be a lot of difference and you still can be a normal kid. So in the end, this is kind of how it goes. You have to understand stuff before you say it, usually, or else you're talking about something you don't know anything about, which only faculty do. Generally, cognition sets the pace for language. This is a brain-driven phenomena. However, social use is really important, and it drives early development. It continues through preschool development. And one of the things that's important to know is that there's this process of deepening of knowledge that happens. So kids pretty early on know a word like cup, and it refers to one cup. And by the time they're about 3 years old, they might know plastic cups that you nest and cups that you drink from, but not yet measuring cup or cup of coffee or Dresden china cup that if I touch it, my mother will shoot me. Over time, the meaning of cup becomes very complex. And if all of you popped up above your head what you think of as cup, in this room we'd probably have prototypical examples and lots of very specific examples, including cupping your hand to drink water out of the fountain. That deepening, broadening, and specification of a word like cup is one of the phenomena of language learning that's so difficult to account for, because we literally do that with every word that's in our vocabulary. So even though kids at 4 might have 1,500 words, the depth of meaning for those 1,500 words is really different than your depth of meaning for those words now. And so language becomes a lifelong learning process, and although you get the bones of it from learning those rules, you constantly revise and resubmit for further learning. So in the first 5 years of life, things move really quickly from mostly being a nonverbal communicator to being ready to read. And the ways we use language and what we use it for and how we use it changes rapidly. Okay, so far you know that language is complicated. First words are predictable. It goes by quickly. There's a lot of variability for individual kids. And that behind that is cognition and social use. You've just gone through my whole first semester language course. That was good. You all are fast learners. So one of the things we're interested in is how does language learning happen so fast? We learn more in the first 5 years of life than we probably do in any other 5-year period ever, although that's probably arguable. Well, there are two big factors. One is the brain development, and the other is the social and linguistic input from caregivers. And I'm really not going to talk about brain development today, except to make this one really important point, which is that we often think about there being a particular period in development where the brain is so important, and certainly there are, and when we're talking about preemies, we're really concerned about early brain development, and we're really concerned about the sensitivity of the brain to all sorts of insults. We know that first 18 months of life, the brain is enormously malleable, and that's part of what makes language learning go well. But we also know that in the first 5 years of life, you've done at least 2 big semantic brain reorganizations, and you're going to do more. And that for our whole lives, the brain continues to be enormously important, not just in the obvious ways, but we know that any physical insult to the body or any traumatic event gets reflected in language, usually through the pathway of the brain. And so general health, as well as things like stroke or traumatic brain injury, have enormous impacts on language because they have impacts on the brain. Kids come genetically probably wired for language, with good wiring and bad wiring, a little bit of faulty wiring sometimes, and that's such a template for what's going to happen. But on the other hand, kids could come in wired for language, and if they had no one to talk to, they would have no language. And television won't work as a substitute because it has to be interactive.
About television in a minute. You mentioned the effect of parents, and you talked about a little bit longer view of the biology of the male. But going back 100 years ago, where we didn't have television, I'm just wondering if the breadth of our language stronger back 100 years ago than the effects on media in our language today?
It's hard to know what the measure of that would be. Kids learn more words sooner, which is interesting now than they did, but we don't have good data. People in my field are old, but we're not that old. I don't think we know. I wish we'd had Lena's, which I was talking to some of you about before I came in, these little digital processors that we put on babies to hear what they hear. I don't know the answer to that. And I think it bears on that earlier discussion about is using language differently, we have more kinds of input now. Is that good or bad? I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
Well, it seems too that the attitude towards children is so different now.
How so?
Well, I don't know that if 100 years ago people made a point of sitting down and having dinner with their children.
100 years ago, they were on the farmlands and the kids had to go to work earlier.
Right,
There was less parent intervention.
So I just wonder if that sort of makes up for it, or the attitude that you have towards language in general. I mean, children are to be seen and not heard, that sort of thing.
There is data that our attitudes toward children have changed to be more benevolent and positive and family-oriented. But it isn't true for every family. There's, individual differences are enormous in how people parent. I don't know if we know the answer to that. In terms of is it better or worse, it certainly is different. It certainly is different. Anybody else got an opinion about that?
I would think that you have, with all the with television, that you're exposed to so many more words. I think it has to expand your vocabulary as opposed to just a one family on a farm situation.
Depends if it was my German mother or not. But what's interesting about television? There is a lot of research on children and television. And television exposure doesn't increase vocabulary in the way that talking to people does. And that's pretty clear. It isn't necessarily harmful or inhibitory, but it isn't a substitute for interaction. Because kids learn language not just by listening to things, but by what goes on between us back and forth. And I'll give you some examples of that in a minute. As kids get older, think about this. Language learning becomes decontextualized over time. In the beginning, you learn because you're face-to-face with your mom and your dad. And it's like, whoa, hello, it's you and me, honey. And that's sort of the beginning of language. Over time, kids get better and better at observational, decontextualized learning. So, we do learn things from television. I'm not even going to tell you what I've learned recently from television, but it's shocking to me what I've learned from television. But in early development, it's not the same because it's not transactional. And so the baby Einstein stuff, the studies on that are not very impressive. If you look at the decent studies on that, doesn't help all that much. Is it better than the 6 o'clock news in terms of what your child should watch? Probably, because at least it's not traumatic and there's not trauma. But it doesn't necessarily stimulate brain development or help kids learn language any sooner. It doesn't have negative effects, but it also doesn't have language facilitating effects.
You read Hands of My Father?
I do know that.
Yeah, in that whole discussion of being raised by two pro-family deaf parents, but he credited the radio being on as part of his English development.
For hearing
But
language.
He had the interactions.
Right.
He learned sign as a
Right.
young child.
And sign is not a less effective way of communicating than language, except that not very many people know sign. That's not your fault if you're a signer. It's our fault that we're monolingual. So we could think about signing as a second language. It's more like a second language because it has a different grammatical structure and there are different systems of signing. But mostly what disadvantages kids who are deaf or hard of hearing is they just don't have access to the same amount of input and as much intimate interaction with people where language is modeled, shaped, and responded to. But no cognitive differences necessarily. And I think that's an important thing to know about. So it turns out that parents are profoundly important. In the child development literature, there's probably more about parent input to kids around learning language than any other single topic. And although there's lots of different theories about how this works, strong and weak theories about the importance of parenting, in the beginning, parents are the first teachers, and they are enormously important. Does it have to be a parent? Can a nanny be a good language teacher? Absolutely. What's important? That you have a social, connected relationship with a caregiver. It can be multiple caregivers, and grandmothers, brilliant grandmothers, are especially good.
Well, what effect does it have when there's a lot? Like when I first started getting him, he was 2 months old, and I had him 3 to 4 days a week. Dad had him 2 days a week. Mom had him 2 days a week. I mean, does it make a difference when you have so many? Then there's grandma. They'd go to visit grandma. Does it make a difference when there's that many different caregivers?
In lots of cultures, there's a new movie out called Babies that everybody should go see. That is the pattern of parenting, and kids turn out just fine, thank you. It isn't about how many caregivers you have. It's about stability, safety, caring, responsiveness, all of those things. It's different, not better or worse. One of the hardest things I think for kids is to only have a couple people and then to have a very hard time coming into school because they haven't been with a lot of adults.
Now, since then, he started I have him less and he's in daycare 2 days a week, which I have seen great improvement in his language, just being in daycare. It's made a huge difference for him.
For all that I'm going to say about parenting, one of the humbling things I've learned in Head Start is that we think it's all about kids talking to adults. It's not. It's about kids talking to kids. And that it turns out that, for your whole life, there's all this stuff going on that you never told your parents. It's also true when you're a 3-year-old. And the best conversations are usually between 2 kids. But parents do, or grandparents or caregivers, model the entire language system. You have to have that. And you have to have somebody that's calibrated to you. And this is where caregivers make a huge difference. That this dance thing, this matching of the caregiver being out in front of the child and being able to change to meet the child is enormously important, regardless. Language learning is a transaction. And what I like to think about is that both the teacher and the learner are changed by that transaction. You change as a parent, you change as a teacher when you interact with little kids, as well as they change. And it really is that the child is responding to you and you're responding to the child, and that going back and forth, or scaffolding as Jerry Bringer has called it, is like a dance that moves on and gets more complex and more elaborate as you go. Kids that are hard to read make that hard for you to be a good parent or to be a good teacher. And that's true for lots of different kids. I'll talk about that in a second. Over time, you change as a parent, and kids change. You're very different with a 3-year-old than you are with a 5-month-old. Very different with your 18-month-old than you will be when he turns 4. And the really important thing about the caregiving relationship is that change is coordinated over time, and that kids are always getting the models of what they need next, not what they already know. And it's hard to do that if you don't know kids. So it's a natural process, but actually what we do as adults to match our children is pretty complicated. If you pick up a baby, as soon as I saw this little person who was over here, you notice my voice tone changed. It's a baby! It's a baby! We do that naturally. Well, that is a biologically adaptive thing because babies hear in a pitch range that's different. They hear better in that range when our voices go up a little bit. When we change the prosody or the shape of what we're saying to emphasize things, it makes them easier to detect where the word boundaries are. And we do that without ever even thinking about it. We do this pointing and showing and giving, and we're redundant as all get out with kids. All of that modification you don't do with another adult. You do it with kids because that interfaces so nicely with the language learning process. We model all kinds of things, sounds, words, but also how how you use language, like the routine of saying goodbye or saying your prayers at night or any number of routine ways. And just the way you switch codes, how you're really nice to the minister after church in a different way than you're nice to your grandma. We modeled that kind of code switching for kids very early on. There are two kinds of modeling that turn out to be really important, and they share the same principle of modeling right when kids talk. And that turns out for all of our learning that it works better, you learn better, if I teach you something in response to what you say rather than just saying it. As usual, I have 96 slides. We're halfway through and it's 2:30. So I'm going to stop there, but I'd love to answer questions or talk to any of you afterwards. You were great. It's hot in here. It's a boring afternoon. You all were wonderful. Thank you for coming. And good luck with the children in your lives. I bet they're going to turn out to be talkers. It's pretty much dependable.